The top business stories live from Sky News' headquarters. Countdown to the Bank of England's latest interest rate decision at midday. Are outdated ethical standards holding back the UK's investment in defence? Plus, the head of Lloyd's of London on why Donald Trump's tariffs could push up insurance costs. Very good morning. Welcome to Business Live with me, Darren McCaffrey, on this Thursday morning. Now, the Bank of England will announce its latest interest rates decisions at midday in just under half an hour's time. They're expected to be held for now. The latest job figures out this morning suggest wages are rising too quickly for the bank to be cutting rates any faster. Let's speak to Catherine Nice. She's Chief European Economist at PGIM, fixed income, and a former economist at the Bank of England. Very good morning to you. And we're expecting a decision of no change effectively today, Catherine.
That's right. I think the Bank of England are going to stay on what they call their careful and cautious path in terms of setting interest rates. And that is for one of the reasons that you mentioned, that inflation, wage growth is still running at rates that are just too high relative to the 2% inflation target. And I think we also have to recognize that this is happening against a backdrop of a lot of uncertainty, both here at home in terms of what's the fiscal situation is, and of course on the global perspective with the prospect of renewed trade tensions.
Trade tensions, indeed, and that's the difficult thing, isn't it, for central banks at the moment. Trying to plan out what may well happen this year is proving increasingly tricky, isn't it, with, the decisions of the US president being one of those factors, but also what might well happen with Ukraine and Russia.
Absolutely. I think sticking to trade, there's a couple points to make here. Firstly, just the uncertainty itself is very depressive for growth. It creates an environment where it kind of makes sense to wait and see what happens before making big decisions, for example, around investment. But of course, if firms collectively hold back on investment, that itself is very depressive for growth, not only today, but also for tomorrow, in the sense that all that foregone investment means that we will inherit, less capital, lower capital stock when we wake up tomorrow. So that's the first point. I think another thing is there does seem to be signs that perhaps the UK can avert being in the firing line in terms of significant trade tensions with the US. But of course, even if that's the case, if there are significant in trade tensions between the US and the EU, these are our two biggest trading partners, that is going to have a negative spillover effect to the UK. So the point I'm making here is we can't sort of avoid it entirely.
Catherine, talk to me about wage growth, though, because it's been pretty resilient, actually. Wages continue to outpace inflation by a bit of a margin. How much will that weigh on the decision that the MPC will be making this morning?
I think that will be an important factor into their thinking. That said, it is in some ways, the positive flip side to what we're seeing. A good reason why I think the Bank of England feel that they can take this cautious and careful approach when it comes to cutting interest rates is because the UK labour market does continue to look quite solid. People are working, unemployment is low, people are in jobs, wages are growing at rates such that people's real incomes are recovering. That should help support growth. So this is in some ways, a good reason for why the Bank of England can remain sort of careful and cautious when it comes to these further rate cuts.
But conversely, when it comes to employment, again, the headline figure is pretty good, isn't it? But that does mask two things, which is continually the Office for National Statistics say, actually, the measurement when it comes to employment is not particularly sound at the moment. They're having real difficulties trying to gauge that. And then you add to the fact that lots of people are essentially not included in those figures. And we've had a big discussion about that this week, haven't we? Because they're on welfare, if you like. And that's interesting because, as I say, historically, the employment figure is pretty good, but it may be masking certain kind of underlying trends that headline figure is not picking up.
That's true. We are seeing a deterioration in surveys. This is not unique to the UK. You're seeing it in other countries as well. But thankfully, we do have, other data that we can look at, that the Bank of England look at to try to get a more holistic, broader sense of what's happening in the labor market. And yes, I think one sort of disappointing aspect of that has been the rise in inactivity that we've seen since the pandemic. Again, this is something that for the UK has been, a real bright spot, something that has compared quite favorably with peers, that employment rates in the UK tend to be very high. And we saw that deteriorate a bit in the pandemic. But if we just focus on the very latest data that we're seeing over the last couple of months, we have seen some improvement on this dimension, with, of course, the caveat that this data is a little bit less reliable than before. But I think the very big picture here is that the UK labor market remains solid. That will give the Bank of England conviction that they don't need to be, rushing into, aggressive interest rate reductions because of a big fear around the labor market. But that said, there is this uncertainty. We don't yet know how firms are going to absorb these changes that were announced that will impact the labor market back in October. And so, we could see a shift in that stance going forward. But that is not in the data as of today.
OK, Catherine, really appreciate your time this morning. Catherine Nice there. Thank you for joining us here on Sky News. And of course, we will have full coverage of that interest rate decision from midday here on Sky in, just over 20 minutes' time. Now, the head of Lloyd's of London, John Neal, has warned that the growing global trade war sparked by Donald Trump will push up insurance prices. Lloyd's today announced profits of £5.3 billion for 2024, but that was down 10% on the previous year. Those profits were impacted by some pretty big disasters in the United States, not least of all, of course, those LA wildfires and the collapse of the bridge in Baltimore. Well, let's speak to John Neal, Chief Executive of Lloyd's of London. A pretty tough year in many regards, John, with, as I say, those unusual but very significant events.
Yeah, it was fun enough, actually. The frequency and cost of large and complex losses was actually below average last year. But we did have, two hurricanes did make landfall in the US. We'll remember Milton, we'll remember Helene. We had the Baltimore Bridge crash that we were dealing with. So there were a few losses, but as you've rightly highlighted, I think performance was strong, capitalizing on what's good insurance market conditions and, dare I say, good economic conditions. So we're actually getting a return on the other side of the P&L on the assets that we hold on the balance sheet.
So what's proving a bit of a drag then if things are down 10% on 2023?
You've got me going. It's mark-to-market accounting, dare I say it, where you need to take a view on your assets at a given point in time. So it's one of those weird anomalies where you see a little bit of a drop as interest rates went up in the last quarter of the year, and you'll see that come back this year. But actually, performance really solid in 2024 as it was in 2023.
OK, let's talk about tariffs, because you're suggesting that could be the big impediment this year, the kind of uncertainty, if you like, or the impact that they could well have if Donald Trump goes as far as he's suggesting he may well do.
Yeah, it's an interesting one for us because, as you sort of highlight, Lloyd's is incredibly distinctive in what we do in insurance. We are truly global. We actually trade in over 200 countries, would you believe? We've got a trusted brand that's recognized, and we've got a framework for managing and assessing risk. So you're absolutely right. In a world that's protectionism is growing, we talk about nationalism, we talk about geopolitics. In some respects, that brings challenges. Dare I say, in others, it heightens the perception of risk in the eyes of businesses or individuals or governments. So actually, we feel okay. We're well understood in the US, for example, and valued there. So it may well give us opportunities as much as it gives us challenges and threats.
It may be opportunities indeed, but are you overall concerned about the direction of travel, which you talked about there, which is, a world that does seem to be growing more protectionist, a bit more nationalistic, kind of shutting itself off, if you like, from other parts of the world?
I think it's, dare I say it, we have an advantage. The history of Lloyd's. Lloyd's has been operating globally for well over 300 years. So we have trading credentials and capabilities around the world. And I genuinely think at this juncture, businesses in particular need insurance to help them with the challenges that we're talking about. So we feel okay. I say okay, you've got to be careful. You can't be too optimistic in a world of risk, but we actually feel okay. We feel well positioned. You know, wearing a UK PLC hat, we feel well positioned to represent the best of financial services from the UK looking out.
And John, just coming back to those events that we did see hit, you know, some of them quite significant, some of them, frankly, kind of unprecedented, or certainly haven't been seen for a long time. We live in a world in which the climate is changing.
Yeah.
Lots of people are saying, frankly, the bills are only going to increase. And more importantly, for some people, they may not be able to get any type of insurance at all. How are you factoring that in? How or what impact is that having in terms of your forward planning about what the next 5-10 years looks like for Lloyd's of London?
Sure. It's a great question. I think you're right. We're in a world of risk, aren't we? You're talking about, interest rates activities. You've got interest rates, inflation. You've got systemic risk we saw through COVID. You've got geopolitical uncertainty. You've got climate. We feel, if you like, it's our world being able to measure and manage the risk. So we feel fine and capable of providing insurance. We have the capital available to do so. I think what we've got to do is get a lot better at explaining the value proposition that we represent, i.e. giving people the confidence that they are making a smart choice when they buy insurance. Even in some of the most developed economies of the world, take the terrible losses for the wildfires in California, you've still got roughly 1 in 3 people not insured. So I think our job is to turn around and say, hey, this is how insurance actually works and responds in these circumstances. It'll be the same here. We're very prone to flooding in the UK. There's a lot of people still do not buy flood insurance in the UK. So I think we've got a job to do to explain the value proposition, and we've certainly got the confidence of the capital to provide the cover.
But, there'll be people watching at home will be suggesting they haven't got insurance because it's increasingly difficult to get it.
Yeah, I think it's not, I would say if people watching in the UK, there is critical availability for insurance. When we draw the parallel, looking at some of the pictures you're looking at in the US, Americans buy twice as much insurance as Europeans do because they're more used to the natural catastrophe type losses. We look at fire, we look at flood, we look at tornadoes, we look at hurricanes. So because they encounter loss, they're more likely to buy insurance. So, we've got to give people the confidence and the understanding of the value of buying insurance, because there is value in buying it. Our job is to stand up at just the point in time when people need us most.
And John, very finally, I read that you're leaving, though, at Lloyd's of London. You're moving on. Somewhat, I'm told, a little bit unexpected. What, dare I ask why?
No reason. I think there's a time when the market's going to value and need you. And I think there's a time when you should move on. And I think the market's in good shape. There's a great leadership team behind me. And that leadership team will be smarter and brighter and more intuitive and more innovative than me. So it's the right time to let someone else lead the market through to its next generation of hopefully growth and sustained profitability. OK. John Neal, the outgoing Chief Executive of Lloyd's of London. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning here on Sky.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Now, military figures are set together in London today to discuss plans for a peacekeeping force in Ukraine as European nationals begin to ramp up the defence spending. It comes as leading UK defence suppliers are calling on British banks to boost lending to domestic manufacturers to help ensure that the UK can meet its security needs. The industry has long complained that outdated ethical standards are holding back investment and are demanding a change in the light of the growing global defence demands. Our business and economics correspondent Paul Kelso has more.
The British Army call this the Jackal. A versatile vehicle favoured by special forces, it was developed and tested here in Devon and deployed on battlefields from Afghanistan to Ukraine.
It's got lateral head restraints, enhanced rock rollover protection system.
It's the sort of kit that British forces and their allies may be needing more of in an uncertain world. That presents an opportunity to the family firm that developed the Jackal. But finding investment and winning contracts can be a battle.
We have absolutely felt the disinterest from banks to invest in defence industry, which is been really hard to deal with over the last few years. We're hoping that the tide is beginning to change and that actually maybe some of the patriotic feelings that actually we need a defence industry, particularly right now, will help persuade the banks that actually investing in defence industries is good for UK growth.
Rethinking the ethics of investment is just one consequence of the government's decision to boost spending on Britain's declining defences. The government wants its extra defence spending to benefit British equipment and British companies like this. The idea is that as national security is strengthened, the economy gets a boost too. Defence spending as a share of GDP has fallen from over 7% in the 1950s to just 2.3% today. The Prime Minister has pledged to increase it to 2.5% by 2027. That's an extra £13 billion a year, but much of that is already committed to replacing our nuclear deterrent, rebuilding stockpiles and supporting Ukraine.
The whole idea is that when we're transmitting and receiving things, we don't want reflections off the walls, basically. So
some of that money will be spent not on trucks, but tech on the digital front line. Multi-billion-pound supplier Leonardo specialises in electronic warfare systems designed to counter and confuse the enemy. Their boss says the industry now needs a clear plan from government.
That forward view is critical. It allows us to invest, it allows us to put our own funding in, and we'll understand exactly what kind of capabilities what we want coming forward. So defence, industrial strategy, comprehensive spending review, all of these reviews coming together from government over the next 6 months will be critical in defining that future and ensuring we respond to it.
With the security outlook changing fast, the British defence industry's challenge is to keep up. Paul Kelso, Sky News.
You're watching Business Live here on Sky News. Did you know it's World Happiness Day today? So we're asking, does happiness at work lead to success in business? We'll be trying to answer that question in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned.
This is how you travel when the mafia wants to kill you.
He's almost given up his own freedom, but that's the price he's willing to pay.
Here, they don't just arrest 'Ndrangheta mafia members, they also live among them.
Time after time, I've seen the devastating impact of extreme weather and climate change.
We don't have much snow at the moment.
They've had a warm spring and exceptionally hot summer, and that means they're expecting to lose more than 3 times the amount of ice than they usually do.
Flames are still forcing people from their homes and leaving many questioning their futures.
Here was my life. We have nothing. I can't say anything, it's so sad.
This disaster is testing the resolve of everyone on this island.
The only way out now is by boat.
Everything you see is devastated, and the misery being felt by people living here is repeated in towns and villages across Central Europe. Sky News, get the full story first.
Turkey is burying its dead. The loss is profound.
Whole families died in this collapse, generations wiped out.
The violence has penetrated the heart of the city rather than being contained to the estates around the edge, and that speaks to the level of anger being felt here. In Sweden, police have seized a lethal stash. This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
This is an example of an advert, really. Anyone of any age could say, I'll do that for £1 million, and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes.
I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club.
4 more years!
Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
I just took a shower above the clouds. You know why? Because this is the Emirates A380. Fly Emirates, fly better.
Now, today is officially World Happiness Day. So, are you happy in your work, and does workplace happiness lead to better success in business? Let's speak about all of this with Lord Mark Price, former Managing Director of Waitrose and Deputy Chairman of John Lewis, a former Trade and Investments Minister. He's also founder of Workle, the workplace happiness platform, and he's also the author of Happy Economics. He is a man who's done lots and lots of different things. What makes us happy at work, and does a happy workforce, Mark, make a successful business?
Yes, it's the simple answer to your question. I was very lucky. I spent 34 years in the John Lewis Partnership. And on my first day as a graduate trainee in John Lewis, I was told that the organisation's supreme purpose was the happiness of the people that work there. And that's because the guy that founded John Lewis over 100 years ago had this really simple idea. He thought, if my people are happy, they're going to stay longer, I'll have lower staff turnover, training will stick, sick absence will be lower, customers will get better service, and as a consequence of that, we'll be a more successful business over the long run. And then during my time running Waitrose, we took on supermarkets from competitors. We applied our approach to being happy at work, and I'm delighted to say that the profits were good, the growth was good. So I became a real advocate and practitioner of a view that says, if your workforce are happy, they will work harder, they will give you extra discretionary effort, and you will be more successful.
And then the next obvious question is, how do you make them happy? How do you somehow engineer a happy workforce? I mean, I asked this question at a conversation with Jane Secker, a presenter, just before we came on air. And she said people are happiest at work when they're about to clock off.
Well, if they are, the workplace isn't the best it could possibly be. I mean, there are 6 things. I'll do them really, really quickly. There are 6 things that drive your happiness at work. First, you feel fairly paid, and you'll recognise when you do something well. Somebody actually says, well done to you, that was a good job. Then it's about having the information to do your job, being well enough trained, but also having the information and the context to do your job. Then it's about feeling empowered, that somebody gives you the space to actually go and do that job, that you're not being micromanaged, that you're being trusted, and that your views are being listened to. Then it's that your employer cares for your well-being, genuinely cares for you and your health. Then it's about having a sense of pride. You feel proud of the job you do. You feel proud of the organisation you work for. And then lastly, it's about the relationship you have with your boss, which is critical. Do you have a good relationship with your boss? And are you being developed? So over 34 years with John Lewis, what I learned is that those things are the real drivers of happiness at work. At Workle now, we measure that. We work with 1,000 companies globally. We drive the Sunday Times Best Place to Work, et cetera, et cetera. So there's loads of data that proves drives performance.
Okay. Lord Mark Price, thank you very much indeed for your time. We're going to have to cut that short. Apologies for that, because we're going to go live to the House of Commons where the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, is making a statement on the situation in Gaza. Let's have a listen.
Yet more bloodshed in Gaza. On the night of the 18th of March, Israel launched airstrikes across Gaza. A number of Hamas figures were reportedly killed, but it's been reported that over 400 Palestinians were killed in missile strikes and artillery barrages. The majority of them were women and children. This appears to have been the deadliest single day for Palestinians since the war began. This is an appalling loss of life, and we mourn the loss of every civilian. Yesterday morning, a UN compound in Gaza was hit. I can confirm to the House that a British national was amongst the wounded. Our priority is supporting them and their family at this time. Gaza has been the most dangerous place in the world to be an aid worker. And I share the outrage of the UN Secretary-General Guterres at this incident. The government calls for a transparent investigation and for those responsible to be held to account. The UK is now working closely with partners such as France and Germany to send a clear message. We strongly oppose Israel's resumption of hostilities. We urgently want to see a return to a ceasefire. More bloodshed is in no one's interests. Hamas must release all the hostages and negotiations must resume. Madam Deputy Speaker, diplomacy is the only way to achieve security for both Israelis and Palestinians. The House will know that the ceasefire in Gaza had lasted for almost 2 months, the result of dogged efforts by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. The deal reached in January saw the nightmare of captivity for 30 hostages and the bodies of 8 further victims of Hamas returned to their loved ones. And we all remember the joy of seeing Emily Damari reunited with her mother and family and the desperately needed aid that had begun to flow back into Gaza. Food, medicines, fuel, tents. Children in Gaza had respite from relentless fear. The severely injured could cross the border again for treatment. Palestinians had begun to return to their homes and consider how to rebuild their lives. In the first days of the ceasefire, the UK moved swiftly to invest in the peace. We released £17 million in additional emergency humanitarian funding for the promised surge in aid. We were bringing our total support this year for Palestinians across the region to £129 million. We accelerated work on the pathway to reconstruction, supporting our Arab partners' very welcome recent initiative. And we worked at every level to support negotiations for a permanent ceasefire and the return of every single hostage, and a backed extension to phase 1 of the current deal. But negotiations have been gridlocked for several weeks. Hamas has been resisting calls for release of further hostages in return for a longer truce. Israeli forces did not begin to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor as agreed. And on the 2nd of March, the Israeli government announced it was blocking all further aid deliveries until Hamas agreed to its terms. For weeks now, supplies of basic goods and electricity have been blocked, leaving over 500,000 civilians once again cut off from clean drinking water and sparking a 200% surge in the price of some basic foodstuffs, a boon to those criminals who use violence to control supplies. As I told the House on Monday, this is appalling and unacceptable. Ultimately, of course, these are matters for the courts, not governments, to determine. But it's difficult to see how denying humanitarian assistance to a civilian population can be compatible with international humanitarian law. Though it's important to say I could have been a little clearer in the House on Monday, our position remains that Israel's actions in Gaza are a clear risk of breaching international humanitarian law. The consequences of the ceasefire's breakdown, Madam Deputy Speaker, are catastrophic.
Well, David Lammy there, slightly clarifying his language from earlier in the week about Israel's action in Gaza, which he said was in breach of international humanitarian law, clarifying there that he believes it is in clear risk of breaching international humanitarian law, but strongly opposing Israel's resumption of strikes.